Welcome to the CBF Podcast Conversation. We know that conversations matter, so each week we are grinding through the critical research to bring you the best stories and resources of people doing groundbreaking and innovative work in renewing God's world. I'm Andy Hale, your podcast host. This year we are starting our 9th year of the podcast, bringing you even better interviews worth your time, attention, and collaboration. These episodes are not intended for you to listen to in an island unto yourself. Get online and share your insights, thoughts, and feedback from the podcast on CBF's X, Facebook, and Instagram pages. We also want you to join the CBF podcast community through the CBF Podcast Listener Support page at cbf.net/podcast support. We want to give a special shout out for some of our listener supporters, including the Honorable Charles Qualls, Caroline Bell, Cindy Foldenlore, Trip Hawthorne, Bill Johnson, Carson Fushi, Ralph Stocks, and then a generous anonymous donor that keeps giving in honor of CBF Grump. Thanks for listening, Apex, North Carolina, Anderson, South Carolina, Garland, Texas, Montreal, Canada, Jacksonville, Florida, Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Johannesburg, South Africa. First-time listeners or long-time listeners, we are grateful you were here for the conversation. And before we move on, we want to give a word of gratitude to our annual sponsors, including the Union Presbyterian Seminary Baptist House of Studies, the Garland School of Social Work at Baylor University, Creation Justice Ministries, Baptist Seminary of Kentucky, the Center for Congregational Health, Dawnings, Community Transformation Center, Congregational Ministries Team of CBF Global, and Gardner-Webb University School of Divinity. And now, on to our conversation. Our guest for this week's CBF Podcast Conversation is Brian D. McLaren. He's an author, theologian, activist, and returning guest to this podcast. Brian has spent his life helping readers and faith communities navigate spiritual reconstruction, political disillusionment, and ecological urgency. Brian, welcome back to the conversation.
Always good to be with you, Chris. Thanks for having me.
You're in completely new territory when it comes to returning times to this podcast. So just know that you're kind of in that new tier. So I think we last had you on 2 years ago. So what's been the latest with you?
Well, I keep getting older, and I'm approaching my 70th birthday in several months. And so thinking about this next stage of life, but I feel my creative juices are flowing as much as ever. The sort of ugliness of our times in many ways and the danger of our times, instead of feeling depressed, I think I feel more motivated and energized and committed to doing what I can. Last year, I had a book come out called Life After Doom that was a book about ecological crisis. And and meanwhile, in the background, I've been working on a science fiction trilogy, which brings us to this conversation today. And meanwhile, the rest of my life, my wife and kids and grandkids are bringing me a lot of joy.
All right. Last time we were on, we talked about fishing in South Florida. What about all those guitars you have back there? Is that the hobby you've been picking up?
Yeah, no, I've always played guitar. In fact, back in the days when I had long hair, I made a couple albums. And so, yeah, music's always been a part of my life too.
Well, we won't put you on the spot. It looks like you also have either a violin or something back there too.
Yeah, so. That's right. A mandolin, a violin. Yeah, that's right. And I didn't used to have an office. My office used to be in one end of the living room. And my wife finally got tired of always having her life interrupted by when I was doing interviews or whatever else. So now I have a guest room has become my office, and I can put all of my musical instruments out there.
Well, let's shift to your new work. The Last Voyage takes that journey to another world, literally. It's a dystopian literary novel set on the edge of Earth's collapse and Mars colonization, and asks us what's worth saving, what must be left behind, who can become when we know where we're going. You've written a lot of nonfiction books about the challenge of the church, speaking in the political systems, advocating for environmental and spiritual healing. But this is a literary fiction. Why did the story need to be told as a novel, and why now?
Well, Some folks will remember, like literally 25 years ago, I wrote a trilogy of fiction. It was called A New Kind of Christian. So it was kind of theological fiction, and it was dealing with. It was a story of a pastor and his congregation and his family as that pastor went through a kind of deconstruction process. So a lot of people originally encountered me as a writer through my fiction. I always thought I would come back to fiction, and I realized I better do it soon. And over the last 10 years, as I watched not only our nation, but the world have this sort of turn toward oligarchy, where the richest people in the world end up having huge influence over politics and then huge influence over mass media, cable news stations, newspapers, and social media. It just struck me how much power we're concentrating in the hands of a few people. And what I felt the response that I wanted to give to this wasn't just analysis, but was imagination. So, working in a science fiction genre gave me a space to say, what might happen? Let me imagine what might unfold. And so this book takes place about 30 years in the future, imagining our current trends continuing for the next 30 years. Where would that lead us?
We meet character Colfax, a widowed environmental scientist, and Gabriel, a Guatemalan uh, geneticist, and both are chosen for the last voyage to Mars, a one-way escape from a collapsing Earth. You write, "Time to end my life as I have known it." That line recurs throughout the book. So, what do you mean by that invitation to end your life as you know it? Is that just a literal migration, a metaphor for a spiritual and moral transformation you're asking of your readers?
Mm. Well, yeah, that little phrase comes up a lot. And uh, I think on one level, it's my way of grappling with something that I think is true of the human species. We have been on this long, many centuries long human project that involves taking more from the earth than the earth can replenish, and then pumping out more wastes and toxins and pollution than the earth can detoxify. We had a very big earth and a small human population for a long time, so we could get away with that for a long time. But now I think we're reaching and surpassing the limits of when we can pass on to the next generation a poorer earth every generation. And so that sense that our whole species is at the end of the road for a certain life. And now we're having to imagine what a new life might look like on the other side. With my Christian background, theological background, that's not a bad definition of repentance. Repentance means ending life as we've known it, and to say, what might a new life, a new identity, a new path look like for me?
Gabriel's backstory is stunning. Her scientific brilliance, her tender relationship with her mother, and the lies she tells to protect her.
Mm,
Um, I'm not so pure, she says repeatedly. I
mm.
was not protecting her. I was only protecting myself and my colleagues. Why is it important to ground this planetary dystopian narrative in such an intensely human moments of grief and memory and moral complexity?
Well, one of the really fun and beautiful and touching parts of writing a novel is developing these characters, and you get them and you give them enough definition, and then they begin to kind of take on a life of their own. And Gabriela is a character like that for me, who it's sort of, as you mentioned those words of hers, "I'm not so pure." The irony is she really is one of the most pure-hearted characters in the book. But it's pure-hearted people probably who realize that they're not so pure. And very often the least pure-hearted people are always saying they're perfect, and always criticizing everybody else. But I think the sense that the universal always unfolds in the personal and that we only encounter the universal through the personal, I think that's one of the realities, that one of the limitations of nonfiction. Because in nonfiction, it's very easy to just focus on the ideas or the concepts or the arguments. And fiction forces you to make real characters with their own personal backstory and their own personal pain and their own unfulfilled desires. They become center stage, and Gabriela plays an important role. This Guatemalan young woman plays a very important role in this book. She gets kind of the first word in the book and the last word in the book.
There's a biting critique of global systems in this novel, and you were talking about that a little bit earlier with oligarchs and puppet politicians and pliable religious leaders. One of the characters says the poor are simply the shit in which the oligarchs grow their money.
Mm,
Um, that's the searing line. What are you hoping readers notice about the current moment when they read
mm.
this dystopian image, and how do you hope that critique goes alongside some hope of change?
Yeah. What's the old saying from Frederick Douglass? Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I think a whole lot of people are still unaware of the huge transfer of wealth that's been happening for a long time, but has been super accelerated in recent years. Transfer of wealth from the world's poor to the world's richest, from the world's middle class to the world's richest, from the world's richest to the most super elite rich. And so we end up in a situation, there's some argument on the exact number, but it's a very small number of individuals and families who own as much wealth as half of the world combined. And if it weren't just wealth, if it were just wealth, that would be bad enough. But that wealth is then used to gain political power, as I was saying a few minutes ago. So when you combine wealth and power in this small number of people, it creates a world that where terrible things can be happening, but the powerful control the media so much that you don't even find out about it. And of course, we're having this conversation when a drama about Jeffrey Epstein, this super wealthy person who trafficked human beings to other super wealthy people. All of this drama is taking place in the headlines, and we're wondering if we'll ever find out anything of the truth in this, because the super rich can afford to suppress and hide the truth. Um, I think that's something I hope the book will help people face. And then comes the question, what do we do about it? But we won't even ask the question, what do we do about it, until we face it. And I don't think we faced it in any meaningful way. Although I must say, the word oligarch, more and more people are using it. When I started writing this word, I think a lot of people would have needed, when I started writing this book, a lot of people would have needed this word to be defined for them.
Yeah, not so much a Russian term, but American term. You know,
By the way, that phrase, the poor are the shit in which we grow our money, that is actually a real kind of proverb from the Russian elite.
hmm. It's a tale as old as time. One of my favorite historical books is written by Nancy Eisenberg. It's a book called White Trash, and it's the 400-year-old untold history of classism in America.
Yes.
And it really helps us identify that, again, a tale as old as time, that really those that
Yeah.
control the communication, that control the power, are the ones who are constantly telling us they're going to make our lives better, but are actually utilizing us to make themselves better.
Oh my.
And yet how we never change, right? We
Yes.
still believe these people at their word. Thurman, the Mars recruiter, uses the phrase, "This is a one-way trip. I'm here to ask you to consider ending your life as you know it." Um, how do you understand exile and pilgrimage and loss as a spiritual posture in this
Mm,
book?
yes. Yes, as you ask me that, I think about that poem from a Sudanese woman who lives in Britain, who I know her name, but it just escaped me. But she has a poem where she says she speaks of being a refugee. She's a refugee, and she said, leaving your home is like, jumping into the mouth of a shark. And in this poem, she says, she describes the refugee experience. You only leave your home when staying home is even more terrifying than leaving your home. And and when we think about that image of a refugee, of being forced to leave your home, either because somebody wants to kill you or because there's no food, or I suppose the only thing more terrifying than having to leave your home is being in the position of the people in Gaza, where you're kind of in a giant prison camp and you can't even leave, and you're just left. You're like a captive, being left to starve. Um, but this is a part of human history. People have been stealing the lands of other people for thousands of years and forcing them to flee. Um, and of course, in the Bible, the story of the Jewish people being made exiles, first fleeing to Egypt as climate refugees because a famine took place there, and then becoming enslaved because now they weren't part of the land, and they were disconnected from land. Then they come back, and then other countries conquer them and rule over them. uh, I mean, this is such a backdrop for the whole biblical history. And unfortunately, I think what happened in a lot of our Christian theology is we took exile, this human experience of exile, and we turned it into sort of a spiritual thing for which the physical thing is just a typology, or it's just a symbol. When I actually think there's a much deeper lesson that's much more literal and much more physical and embodied. And here it is. We human beings belong to the earth. We're children of the earth. In the book of Genesis, the name Adam, it means a child of the red earth. And so we human beings are connected to the earth. And when we lose that connection, we don't know who we are. We don't know where we belong. And ironically, that feels a whole lot like the human species as a whole these days. Uh, so many of us are disconnected from the earth, even though we might live in the same nation where we were born. Our daily life takes place in on the internet. Our daily life takes place in another place, and we're so disconnected from the real world in which we live. And then we have increasing numbers of people who are refugees, who are immigrants, who are hated and disrespected and mocked and dehumanized. My goodness sakes, as a whole species, it feels like we've lost our sense of connection. And that's part of what I hope people in reading this novel will feel in an embodied way. They'll see the disconnection that many different characters are grappling with.
When I was reading it, I I kind of was getting in the head of those that were living in Germany during the rise of Nazism
Yeah,
and the exile and fleeing that took place by many folks obviously out of necessity for life for those that were
yeah,
Jewish and the like, but also those that chose to leave because they couldn't live in such a system.
yes,
I read a New York Times article this last week that interviewed several people who are experts around fascism, and they said, "Hey, look, we're leaving right now."
yes,
And so,
yes,
I'm thinking to myself, what is this balance between staying and leaving? And
yes,
where do we fit in kind of the tension that exists there with so many things going on in our culture, specifically in the United States right now, as people of faith who see the ecological, the economic, the endless crisis that are taking place around us.
yes. Yes, in fact, that's a deep theme. As you know, this book, The Last Voyage, is the first in a trilogy. And one of the moral quandaries and one of the moral dilemmas of the characters in this first novel is this small group of people are given the chance to leave the Earth to try to establish a better colony on Mars. And yet if things weren't bad on the Earth, it would be very hard to leave. But once you leave, you feel a certain survivor's guilt, and you have second thoughts about whether leaving is the right thing to do. The way that's going to unfold in the next two novels, the second one's written, the third one I'm in the process of writing now, becomes a live issue in the third novel, which will take place another 30 years in the future when the colony on Mars reestablishes contact with people on Earth, and where they sort of compare notes, what happened to the leavers, what happened to the stayers. And I think this is one of the long-term ways of thinking that we human beings are reaching the end of the road on. We've always had this sense, if I have trouble in one place, we can go somewhere else. But we're filling up the whole earth now. And maybe now we're at this point we have to realize there's nowhere left to go. And we're going to have to figure out what it means to stay and fix things where we can and where we must, and to respect those who are able to find some other place to go because there are things that they'll be able to do in the leaving. But ironically, even those of us who leave, we're still connected to those who stay, and we can't escape the influence of those in power. And this sort of takes us back to those oligarchs with so much power. There's nowhere we can go to escape their power, including space.
Colfax reflects that on Earth, humanity is exceeding its maximum viable population, while Mars, they're building towards a quote minimal viable population. Character says we use the 50-500 rule in avian studies: 50 individuals to avoid short-term inbreeding, 500 to avoid long-term genetic drift. What do you want readers of faith to understand about sustainability, not just ecologically, but spiritually and socially?
Mm. Well, the first thing, uh, I'm making a confession here, and a lot of people may feel the same way, but my theology gave me this idea that God has the future all planned. And in fact, I may have said this in sermons. I know I've heard it in sermons where we say, "Oh, I read the end of the book. There's a happy ending." And we have this sort of idea that to be a Christian, to be a person of faith, means that there is an inevitable happy ending for us. And I actually no longer believe that. I mean, in some ultimate sense, maybe yes, but in a shorter term sense, I reminded of the words in Galatians, God is not mocked. Whatever a person reaps, they will sow. And I think that's true for a nation too, whatever a nation. And it's true for a civilization, and it's true for an economic system. Maybe I can say it like this: for those of us raised in a capitalist system, do we think that God so loves capitalism that capitalism will be exempted from reaping what it sows? And if we just sit back and say, what will it mean for capitalism to reap what it sows? Suddenly, spiritually, we realize that if we let our economics do our moral and theological thinking for us, we could be in a heap of trouble. So one of the things I hope will happen for people as they read this book is they'll start to feel, oh, you know, my theology should actually energize me for being a player and being an agent in the unfolding of what's happening in the world, rather than just someone who says, oh, I'm just passing through, I'm here for a short time. In fact, I will emigrate to a better place at the end of my life, so I don't even have to worry about this. I think that's a way of thinking that's been supported by a lot of Christian theology that I think it would be good for us to shift away from.
One of the most prophetic moments is when Colfax says religious leaders bury their heads in bullshit and put their self-interest above the common good. You've been one of the voices calling faith leaders to wake up. How do you see the church's complicity in collapse? And is there still time for repentance and action?
Mhm. Yeah, we're having this conversation in a tough week to talk about that because our government, aided and supported by Project 25, which is aided and supported by many Catholic and Protestant religious leaders, along with some others, is basically saying climate change isn't real. It's not a health risk. It's not a threat. Not a big deal at all. And so, as if having the government say it makes it true. It reminds me of when the U.S. government said that a black person was 3/5 of a human being. Just saying it, having Congress or a president or a Supreme Court say it, certainly doesn't make it turn out to be that way. So it, this is where faith leaders, it seems to me, have to understand that faith isn't an alternative to truth. Faith is an attempt to open ourselves to all the truth that we can bear, including the truth that we don't understand. And this that creates a humility to say there might be truth that I haven't accepted yet, and there might be truth that I not even capable of understanding yet, but the disposition of my heart, I want to be an openness to truth. And when faith leaders understand that for them to be lovers of their faith means to be lovers of the truth, even the uncomfortable truth, what that does to me is it makes the work of ministry feel so much more significant. Look, I suppose it's not just, I was a pastor for 24 years, so I remember what this felt like to be preparing a sermon and to say what I need to say in the sermon, a lot of people don't want to hear, or they aren't ready to hear, or this will shake them up, or this will get me some angry phone calls or emails. But, I realized in writing a novel, as a novelist, you can just want to entertain people so that they pay the money to buy the book or go see the movie or whatever it is, and not really care about the truth. But if you're an artist who cares about the truth, then it adds both gravity and, I don't know, significance to what you do. I would hope that every clergy person would feel, yeah, we can't solve it ourselves. We're only one voice, but we better use that one voice in the best way we can.
In one scene, the character Eve says, "We're not simply trying to build a replica of what's clearly not working on Earth. We need to become a new kind of human community." Um, that moment reframes the Mars project not as an escape, but as a test of moral imagination. How do we begin forming communities here or there that aren't just engineering solutions for survival, but experiments and belonging and meaning and mutual care? And what are some ways you're seeing people do that?
Yeah, let me just tell a quick anecdote about that. There is a Japanese philosopher and economist named Kojin Karatani. And Kojin Karatani has developed a kind of theory. You might call it a post-Marxian and post-capitalist theory of economics. And he basically says our current form of exchange, he calls it our current mode of exchange, is pure transaction. We measure everything on whether it's a profitable transaction. And we let the profitability of transactions be our ultimate decider. And he says that's going to destroy us. And he makes a very compelling case for how human beings cannot live by transaction alone. And then he says, if there's something beyond transaction, we've only seen it emerge a few times in human history, and it's almost always been in a religious setting, where a religious community creates a set of values that's even more powerful for its followers than whether it's transaction or domination or whatever it is that's the 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 structures of the world that people live in. And it seems to me that this just all becomes almost an exegesis of a couple of verses in the beginning of Romans chapter 12 in the New Testament. Don't be conformed to this world, meaning don't be conformed to this civilization and its structures. Don't be conformed to this economic system and its values. But be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And renewing of your mind, I don't think just means taking new ideas and sticking them in the same old mind, but having the mind itself be changed, what Paul calls elsewhere the mind of Christ. And so it seems to me that this work of imagination, we're having this conversation a few weeks after the beloved Walter Brueggemann passed away. And Walter used that phrase, prophetic imagination. He understood that the work of the prophets in the scriptures and prophets all through history is to open up our imagination to those new ways of life. In whether it's through a sermon or a podcast or a novel, a character speaking in a novel, I think that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to open up people's imagination to better ways, new possibilities.
We had Walter on the podcast twice, and one of my favorite moments with him was, I was trying to get some personal questions in, and he hadn't updated his website in years, and he had on there that he was a big fan of, I can't remember the football team, wherever he was from originally, and I asked him about it, and he went on a 10-minute rant about how the NFL is a current enslavement system for modern times. And it was just priceless.
We can picture that. We can picture that with Walter.
Yeah. Gabriela says we have to center the web of life and decenter our species. That's a evolutionary, ecological, and spiritual shift. What would it mean for Christian theology or for Western ethics more broadly to fully embrace this decentering? And how do we see that as hopeful rather as diminishing? And what does it look like in discipleship standpoints?
Man, there's a huge, wonderful question. We could spend a year of podcasts exploring just that question. So I'm so glad you asked it. Let me just offer two things. One, intentionally provocative. There was a 20th century theologian, Catholic theologian, who I think understood this better than anyone. So much so that he stopped using the word theologian to describe his work. His name was Father Thomas Berry. And Father Thomas Berry he realized that the subject of theology for most Christians, for him as a Roman Catholic, for most of his fellow Catholics, was about where you go after you die. And so what it did is it shifted your attention away from how we live with the earth and how we live with one another and how we live with soil and plants and trees and water. It shifted our attention away from those things to what happens after we die when we're disembodied spirits in heaven. And he felt that, well, in fact, he used to say that the desecration, that the glory of humanity is becoming the desolation of the earth. In other words, we're glorifying ourselves by destroying the earth. And then he said, the desolation of the earth is becoming the destiny of humanity. If we destroy the earth, we destroy ourselves, our children, our grandchildren, their future. And so he said, from this point forward, every human activity must be judged based on the degree to which it contributes to a new human-earth relationship. So what he did is he stopped calling himself a theologian and started calling himself a geologian. And he created that word to say, to think of God apart from the earth is part of the problem. We have to reconnect seeing God inherent in the earth and communicating God's self to us through the beauty of the earth. So that would be a sort of theoretical statement. And then a more personal one. When I was a kid, I always loved the hymn, Fairest Lord Jesus. And the reason I loved it is because it spoke of, fair is the sunshine, fairer is still the moonlight, all the twinkling starry hosts. Fair are the forests, fair are the woodlands, robed in the blooming garb of spring. I love that's hymn because it was a place in church where we sang of the beauty of the earth. But then a few years ago, I noticed it says, fair is the sunshine, fair is to the moonlight, but Jesus shines fairer. And the only reason it's like the song says, oh yeah, nature is great, but Jesus is greater. And in a certain sense, it's a prime example of we only lift up creation so that we can lift up something beyond, so we can lift up Jesus. But what if what Jesus really wants is for us to see God in creation, and to stop pitting one against the other, but to see that creation is actually the expression of God. It's God self-expressing in light and water and soil and photosynthesis and everything else. So that to me, on a very practical level, says that we need to write the hymns of a new way of understanding our place in this world, our connection to this world. And we need to go back and review how our whole theology has been distorted to become an evacuation plan rather than a transformation plan.
There's also the theme of dignity and worth and aging.
Mhm.
Colfax is asked to make the ultimate journey late in life, just as he feels obsolete. What are you trying to say in this novel about wisdom and elderhood and relevance in a world that seems to worship youth and
Mm.
seems to discard others as they age?
Yes. Well, I don't want to do too many spoilers, um, but uh, Colfax, i- in many ways, right when he should be becoming an elder, is still trying to hold on to being an expert and still trying to hold on to being in control. And he's struggling with, he doesn't know what his next stage in life could be. And part of the drama of his character that goes through the whole first novel and then will actually continue in the second novel is Colfax really, just as you said, coming to the place of being first an elder and then coming to the place of accepting that every life has an expiration date and that just as there's a first breath, there will also be a last breath. And so this is part of the drama I think all of us are experiencing in our lives one way or another. Um, and I as Colfax, the character developed, he's so annoying and so arrogant and so narcissistic on one level, and yet we see in him the struggle isn't over to try to live into the dignity of what his life could be as an aging man.
You've written books that challenge our theology, our politics, our practices, and this one feels like it's aimed at our imagination.
Mm,
What do you hope The Last Voyage wakes up in your readers, not just cognitively, but spiritually and emotionally?
yes. So, well, you're exactly right. And first, I just want to say, Andy, all of your questions have been so good, but if this book can help wake up people's imagination, I will be super, super happy. To me, that's why I've always loved fiction, and including science fiction, because it is an invitation for me to, as a reader, to join an author in creating an imaginary world. And in that world, it creates new capacities in my imagination to then look back at the actual world I live in when I close the last page of the book. So I, if I can play a small part in that with folks, yeah, I'll feel so happy.
Our guest is Brian D. McLaren. The book is The Last Voyage. You can find more about Brian's work at brianmclaren.net, including essays, interviews, upcoming events, and more of his incredible writing. Brian, it's always a joy and humbling to speak with you. Thank you for taking us on this voyage and reminding us that exile can still be sacred and ending can still hold grace.
Thank you so much for the great questions. It means a lot to me to have you as a friend and as a reader of this book. Thank you.